There was once a castle deep in a dark, gloomy forest, and in that castle lived an old fairy. The old fairy had a curse placed upon her when she was young. The curse would make her old and ugly so that no one wanted to be around her anymore. The old fairy was still able to take any shape she pleased during the day and would often take the shape of an owl and fly around the forest or creep about the countryside like a cat, but at night she would become an old woman again. This upset the fairy because she had no companions. Everybody feared her, thinking she was the witch. Because of her hatefulness towards all humans, whenever a young man would come within 100 paces of her castle, a spell would make it so that he could not move or speak until she came to set him free, which she would not do unless he gave his word never to come there again. But whenever a young maiden would come close, she would turn her into a bird and put her in a cage and hang her in her castle. The witch that had cursed the fairy did tell her that the only way she could be beautiful again was if she could get the blood of 1,000 young maidens and drink and bathe in it. The fairy had over 700 cages hanging in the castle, all with beautiful birds that were once maidens. There was once a maiden named Jorinda, who was the most beautiful maiden in all the land, and a shepherd lad whose name was Jorindel, who was very fond of her, and they were soon to be married. One day they went to a walk in the forest to try to get some alone time with each other. Jorindel said they must be careful not to get too close to the fairy's castle. It was a beautiful evening, and the sun was just starting to set. Jorinda sat down to watch the sunset, and Jorindel sat down beside her. While watching the sunset, both began to feel sad, but didn't know why. It felt like they were about to be parted from each other forever. They had wandered further into the forest than they had wanted, and had become lost, and did not know which way to go home. The sun was setting fast now. About half of the sun had set behind the hill, and Jorindel turned and looked behind them. He found that they were close to the old castle, sitting in the shadows of the walls unaware. Then he became afraid and turned pale and started trembling. Jorinda was just singing. The ring-dove sang from the willow spray, willow day, he mourned for the fate of his darling mate, Will-a-day. When her song suddenly stopped, Jorindel turned to see why, and found his beloved had been turned into a nightingale. An owl suddenly flew around them 3 times, and 3 times screamed, "To-hoo, to-hoo, to-hoo." Jorindel could not move at all. He couldn't even speak. Now the sun had set, and a gloomy night had set in. The owl flew into the bush, and came out an old fairy. She mumbled something to herself and grabbed the nightingale and went away to the castle. Poor Jorindel could do nothing to save the nightingale. At last the fairy returned and said in a harsh voice, "Tell the prisoner is fast, and her doom is cast. They stay, oh stay, when the charm is around her, and the spell has brought her hie away, away." Suddenly Jorindel found that he could move again, and fell to his knees before the fairy and begged her to give him back his dear Jorinda. But she laughed at him and said he would never see her again, and then disappeared. He prayed and wept for the loss of his beloved, but it was all in vain. "Oh, what will become of me?" He could not return home, so he went to another village and became a sheep herder there. Many days he would walk as close to the castle as he dared, but never did he hear or see anything of his beloved Jorinda. One night he dreamed he found a beautiful purple flower with a pearl in the center. In his dream, he picked the flower and went to the castle with it. Everything that came in contact with the flower became disenchanted, and there he found his dear Jorinda again. In the morning when he awoke, he began searching for this flower. 8 long days he searched, to no avail. Finally, on the 9th day, early in the morning, he found the bloom, a beautiful purple flower with a large dewdrop in the center of it. He plucked the flower and traveled day and night until he reached the castle. He walked closer than 100 paces to it, but nothing happened this time. He found that he could even go all the way to the door. Jorindel was very happy about this and touched the door with the flower, and it sprang open. He walked in the door and listened. He heard many birds singing, and soon he came to the chamber where the fairy sat, with over 700 birds and more than 200 bodies piled on the floor, and in the corner were barrels filled with blood stacked. When the fairy saw Jorindel, she screamed with rage, and for some reason she could not put her hands on him. The flower he had in his hand protected him. He looked around the room and the many birds in cages and wondered how he would ever find his Jorinda. While he was thinking about what to do, he saw the fairy had taken a cage down and was escaping through the back door. He ran after her, but he was not quite fast enough. By the time he reached the fairy, she had already hacked off the bird's head and was draining the blood into a wine glass. As the blood was draining, the bird began to change form back into a human. There before his eyes was his beautiful, but headless, Jorinda. He fell to his knees and screamed in agony. Laughing, the fairy walked past him back into her chamber and took her seat on the throne. Slowly, Jorindel stopped crying and stood up, now filled with rage. He saw the knife on the ground where the body laid and picked it up. Quietly, he crept back into the chamber where the old fairy was, thinking to himself that he would have his revenge. Sneaking up behind the throne, he grabbed the old fairy by her hair and sliced the knife across her throat. She fell over the throne, dead. Walking around to make sure she was indeed dead, he remembered the other birds now squawking. If my dear Jorinda cannot be with me, then nobody will ever see their beloveds again. Jorindel went to each of the cages, still filled with rage, and instead of releasing the prisoners from their spell, he took each one out and removed their heads, and each one turned back into a beautiful maiden. With each bird he came to, he laughed hysterically. Finally, all the birds were dead, and he collapsed in a heap on the floor and quickly fell asleep. When morning came and he awoke, he saw the carnage around the room and remembered he was the one responsible. Deciding then and there he would never leave this gloomy castle, and anyone who dared come near would end with the same fate as the birds.